Record to the cloud. Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing all right today. We're hanging out. It's Wednesday the 8th. We're going to be talking about Flexbox and Grid in CSS, which are two incredibly useful tools in your CSS toolbox, as you'll find out, especially for when you need to lay out things in rows and columns. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a handful of things. Okay. So first off, I'm going to talk about how we used to do things, how we used to organize things into rows, right? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how Flexbox kind of came about. And then I'm going to talk about all the settings you can, or all the values you can provide to Flexbox in order to customize it, and just kind of how you can make it work for your page and some of the stuff that it's good for. Okay, and then after that, I'm going to talk really quickly about CSS Grid. So hopefully this should be an informative experience. All right, so let's go ahead and open up our page here, all right? For our demonstration, I am going to just say that I am a farmer, okay? Now, I sell a variety of things. I sell corn, I sell wheat, barley, a number of things like that. And I want to set up an online storefront where I can show people, hey, this is what I sell. Here's where you can learn more about it, right? So how do you think we're going to go about that first things first, Peter?
You might want a couple of cards,
Yeah, well, we don't necessarily need cards. Now that we've learned that Peter's not a fan of cards, we can use whatever you'd like. Do you have any ideas? We can just live code it right here.
I don't know, just boxes. I mean, you want to have images so people can see what.
Okay, so it sounds to me like we need a div. So if you're following along on the README, you'll see that I'm probably going to be mirroring this pretty closely. I'm going to just go ahead and make a div. I'm going to give it the class name product because, I'm probably going to put a handful of these later on the page. I want to make it easy to customize, right? And I guess we'll use like a header like that. I'll name it, let's start with corn, right? And then if I have an image for it, which I do in my comments here with images that I definitely didn't put for later. And then, of course, the alt, just in case it doesn't load or something like that, and also good for accessibility. In this case, I'm going to do a collection of multicolored maize. Go ahead and close that tag, and then underneath there, I'm going to just add a little description. This is all of my corn. Pretty exciting. Now, I'm not going to refresh just yet, because if you've been paying attention, you've noticed that I've linked in a style sheet here. Now, I did a little bit of prep work before this, and what I did here is my dad came into my room. Anyways, I did a little bit of prep work here. So all I've done is I've linked in a font sheet, so I can use a different font on my website. You might have noticed we're using Poppins here. And then I basically specified that for the body, by default, we'll use Poppins. But if we're doing a paragraph, it'll be Roboto. Then for later on, these guys will be useful, right? So let's go ahead and write some code for our product card. We're not writing code, we're writing style sheets, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just write really quick, give it a max width. In this case, I guess I'll mirror exactly what I did up here for the child. So let's just go ahead and rename it. We'll name it product. And just to explain what this all does is I set a max width, which is equal to 20 font units. REM is root emits, which is basically points of font, right? So it's going to be 20 font units across at the most. I gave it a small border, and that's just light green. And then I gave it a small margin and padding all around. So all that's going to do is just draw a nice, neat little border around it, make sure everything's nice and spaced. And then under here, we'll learn a little bit about this later on in the week. But what I'm doing is saying that images in a product class should have this width, and they should have padding around the left and right edges. So now that we understand what that does, let's go ahead and refresh. All right, there we go. We've drawn our product card, our product piece, all right? In this case, we were using corn, but obviously I sell more than corn. As I mentioned, I also sell barley, and I also sell wheat. Now, I also have my images right here. I'm gonna go ahead and put them in just because they're a little nicer to look at than just looking at a bunch of pictures of corn. Collection of, and I'll change these as well. So we'll just say wheat up close and barley. Okay, so before I refresh this, do you guys remember specifically, Peter, do you remember what this is going to display like? Think about the display block.
Just gonna go down the page.
Yeah, exactly. It's just going to stack right on top one another. So let's refresh, take a look. Bingo. Right on top of one another. But that's not what I wanted to do, right? So I mentioned earlier I want to create a row of my products, right? I want to make everything, nice and easy for the viewer to see. I want the reader to be able to look at the page and immediately see what I'm selling. So I'm going to show you the old way of doing things, which you should not do anymore. But Matt has a perplexed expression. Are you okay, Matt? Okay, cool. So what I'm going to show you first is how we used to format things into rows, okay? It's not very common anymore. It's still used for data. And the answer to this is table. So back in the day, and still a little bit today, you would use a tag called table to format your page into rows, okay? Now, the way the table tag worked is you would declare a region that would expect, just like an HTML tag, a body, in this case a T body. And then inside of your T body, some pieces of table data, right? And it would also expect rows. So the way you'd organize it is the table is declared, then the table body is declared, and then a table row is declared. And then wait, there's even more. Each one of these pieces needs to be a piece of data, which we wrap with table data, TD. Pretty awful to look at, if you ask me. And that is probably the first point that I want to get at here. This way of organizing things into rows is very difficult to read, not just for you as a developer, but for things like screen readers, right? I mean, you can imagine if a computer is scrolling through your page, trying to make sense of what's on it, what is it going to do when it encounters a table, right? It's going to try reading off the data points like it would, right? As you would read a table. But that's not what we're doing here. We're using it for organizational purposes. And that's the opposite effect here, right? We want to make it easy for the viewer to understand, for the reader to understand. So if I refresh this, you haven't seen a table before, so I don't expect you guys to know this, but we'll see that it makes a nice table for us, right? Do you notice anything that's a little weird about this that I may want to change?
The shapes aren't all the same size.
That isn't, yeah, exactly. Peter, really on point today. It's not super pleasant to look at, right? It's like, if I'm looking at a table, especially, for visual, like organizational purposes, I'd like for everything to be the same size, right? But like, these are just a few things that I wanted to point out, right? So HTML document, pretty much illegible if we're using tables for organization. The elements inside of the table row are not the same height. Some other things that you might want to consider is what's going to happen if I change like how my viewport looks. So what I've done here is I've opened up inspect element, right? I'm going to go ahead and dock it to the left. And you can see if I'm changing the size of my viewport, like let's say I'm on an iPad or an iPhone and I turn my phone, to a different angle, things are going to get kind of weird and it's hard to predict how things are going to look, right? And the last thing I wanted to address is this isn't a huge issue, but if we look at each piece of table data, you can see here on the breakdown, right, that there's actually a very tiny amount of padding. So it's not exactly the styling that we had in mind. So that just kind of breaks down all the reasons that table formatting is bad, okay?
One extra thing I'll just toss in here is
it.
related to the mobile thing that Leo was talking about. So as Leo resizes his viewport, right, you'll notice on most well-designed websites, maybe the layout will change as it gets thinner. But with tables, you can't do that. So this is really, really hard to read. And you probably would want to stack them on top of each other at a certain breakpoint, right? Maybe if the screen is smaller than 1,000 pixels or something. So you can't do that with tables without some really bad CSS hacks. So that's something else to keep in mind as well. And this is something called responsive web design. And we'll talk about this tomorrow in a bit.
Correct.
But yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so that's kind of a key point here as well, is that if you're resizing the viewport, you want it to be able to adapt to those changes and not look ugly. And you don't want all the information you're trying to convey to get mangled in the result. So I'm going to show you guys how to organize this in a much more clean way, much more responsive way with Flexbox, okay? So let's go ahead and get rid of all of this mess of tags, right? So I'm going to just go ahead and clean out all those lines. This is going to be, unfortunately, I cannot reindent this. But what we're going to do is just create a single div around all of these. And I gave it the class container. Unfortunately, by the way, for those of you who do know a lot about VS Code, I cannot do multi-cursor because I'm on VS Codium, which is an open source telemetry-free compilation of the software. So, fun fact. Anyways, so I'm just going to go ahead and clean all this up so it's easy to look at. Amazing. Now, if we refresh, as expected, it's still stacked, right? Well, that's not what we want. We want to make things into a row, right? All right, I'm going to show you something that's going to change your world, okay? We're going to change a single property to make this into a very nice, responsive row. Do you have any idea what that might be, Peter?
Gosh, I really wish it was something that was like flexible.
I really wonder what it could possibly be. Here, let's try. Oh, flex. Wow. Nice job. So we take a look and look at that. Almost instantly, okay? We've solved most of the big problems that we had. One problem that we do not really deal with in this lesson is the images aren't like, they don't look the same size, but that's beside the point.
Wait, I think I covered that in the second CSS lesson.
Matt covered that in the second CSS lesson. Go check it out. I'm not going to use it here because we're going through Flexbox. But anyways, now that we have a flex container, right? We've specified in the CSS for our container that it is display flex, right? We have instantly solved a good deal of our issues, right? So now we have all of the elements the same height. They all look nice. They're in a clean row. Where things might get a little weird, though, is we still have these weird viewport changing issues. However, you'll learn very soon that it's actually incredibly easy to make changes when you hit a certain viewport breakpoint when you're working with Flexbox. So, okay, another thing to note just before we move on is that we've like cleaned up the HTML document significantly, right? It's much easier to read for both us and for anyone who doesn't have CSS enabled or cannot see it, right? So pretty handy. All right, this is a good demo or good transition into just talking about some of the critical concepts, okay? So I have a diagram in this README, which I'll pull up right now, of the areas I'm going to talk about, right? Once you declare a Flexbox container, which is what we've done right here with this div, right, container, you instantly have, there we go, the markdown rendered, you have a number of regions that we can talk about, right? And a number of values that are used in Flexbox properties to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of break down what each of those mean before we actually get into the thick of it and changing the values and going in and customizing it. So Flex start. Well, first off here, let's talk about the big one. there are two axes that form when you declare a Flexbox container, okay? The main and the cross. Now, the main axis goes in the direction that you want. So if I have a Flexbox row and I don't have it row reverse, we'll learn about that in a sec, then it would be going from the left to the right. It would just be, you can think of it as an arrow straight across the middle, just like they show here in this diagram, which, by the way, is pulled from the official spec from W3C. And the cross axis is always going to be perpendicular to that, right? So it's going to be in the opposite direction and perpendicular, right? So since we're looking at a row here, both in this diagram and in here, the cross axis will be going
there.
Yeah, it's going to be going down. So it'll go from top to bottom. Okay, great. There are also some other areas we can talk about really quick, which we'll learn a little bit more about and have a greater understanding of when we see them in action. And that's flex start, meaning the start of the flex container, right? So if I'm looking at a row, it's at the left-hand side, and flex end, which would be the end of the container, looking at a row again, be at the right-hand side. The center, that's pretty self-explanatory. And we'll learn about these definitions right here, being space between, around, stretch, evenly, a little bit later, which has to do with distributing free space in the container. Okay, great. So we've learned about some of the key areas. Let's talk really quick about how we can customize the actual flow of our container, right? I talked about how the main axis is always in the direction of the container, of the container's layout, right? So if we're talking about a row, it's left to right. And if we're talking about a column, then it's going to be top to bottom. And there are the reverse counterparts of that, right? So something that I had mentioned a little bit earlier was, well, here, first let's go ahead and show the direction here, which is set via flex direction, as one might expect. So if I wanted to make it into a column, you can provide that value right here. If I wanted to make it into a backwards row, meaning right to left, then we do row reverse. And then there's also the counterpart for column, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at what this is going to look like on our page. So when we set things to column, it forms exactly what we might expect, right? Now, here's where things are going to get interesting. What if I say column reverse? What do you think's going to happen?
It'll reverse. Like a
Exactly. The elements are going to go, they're going to get swapped. So in this case, corn is going to end up at the bottom, right? And if we were to say row reverse, then corn's going to be at the right. So the direction sets how the elements in the document are laid out, right? So first we lay out corn. Start from the right, we put corn. Then we lay out barley. Start from the right, we see corn's there, we put in barley. And that's how it works, right? So that's the first part of what is called the flex flow, right? The flow of the container. The second part that we should talk about is the wrapping behavior. So remember how I mentioned when we were looking at the chaining viewport, things were kind of strange because it still has that weird kind of everything's the same height, but it adjusts the width so it's on the same row deal going on. Well, the trick for this is we can do a handy little property called flex wrap. And there's only two values you can give for this, and it's not true or false, actually. Or actually, there's three values you can give this, but it's not true or false. It's wrap, wrap reverse, and no wrap. So no wrap is what we have going on right now, right? It treats all of your elements in the container as though they were in a single row or a single column, right? So in this case, it's going to try and keep them all on the same line and give them the same amount of space. But if we were to change this to, say, wrap, then when it runs out of space on one end of your viewport, it's going to wrap that element back around. Now, things are a little bit weird here, though. Why is the wheat down here?
You have row reverse on.
Exactly. We have row reverse on. Peter, he's on fire today. Yes, we have row reverse on, so it's going to wrap down to the bottom right. But if we were to say wrap reverse, then things get weird. What ends up happening is it starts wrapping it in the opposite direction, right? So this is a property that you, or this is a value that you don't see used a whole lot, but it's good to know. This is just kind of to help you understand how the flex flow plays into this. And
I will just quickly point out, in the context of your portfolio website, how this could be useful is that lots of people have cards that explain projects they've done or places they've interned at or stuff like that. And you often want to control the wrapping behavior there, right? Especially if each of the things are different sizes, which I think Leo will talk about in a moment.
So obviously the images don't line up, but yeah, you can just imagine. Use it for little highlights. Okay, so before we move on, you may have noticed I've been saying flex flow a lot, right? Talking about the flow of the container. And the answer for that is there's a property you can use to set both of these in one line in CSS, and that's flex flow. So the way it works is you say flex flow followed by the behavior, the direction, right? We can say row reverse, followed by the wrapping behavior. Let's just say wrap. And that sets both of those properties for you in one very neat, easy to understand line. Pretty handy to know. Great. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about how we can work with some other parts of a Flex container, right? We've talked about how we can lay out the items within it. We've talked a little bit about how we can basically deal with the wrapping behavior. What are some other things that we might want to consider, though, when we're thinking about a row or a column? Just think about it for a bit.
Maybe we want to make some some tiles larger than other tiles. I don't know if that would be useful.
Yeah, that's actually a great answer. So yeah, maybe we want to make one of our tiles, one of our projects, right? If we're talking about our portfolio. Again, we're going with a farm stand here, but you can make this your portfolio very easily. We could talk about if we wanted some items to be larger than others, right? So in that case, we're going to pick out one specific, oh, there's Matt. We're going to pick out one specific item. In this case, I'm going to pick out wheat, right? And I'm going to say this is the highlight of my storefront, right? I want to show off all my wheat. It's cool. Then we're going to go ahead and target it. How might we target wheat?
We reference highlights.
Exactly. We're going to go ahead and reference the highlight. And what we can specify is the growth behavior of it, okay? Now notice that this is a child element. This is an element in the flex row, in the flex container, right? So we're not talking about properties that control the flow of the entirety of the container now. What we're talking about are properties that you would apply to specific elements, right? You can think about this like maybe if I have a class that says big project, right? Then I would want all of those to be double the size of the other ones, right? Or I want them to be larger than the others. Well, luckily for us, there is a property we can set, and that is flex grow, okay? So flex grow is an interesting little property that allows you to control whether that particular element, right, should grow to take up extra space than its neighbors, right? Or than other constituents in its row or column. And the way that you would set this is just with any number. It can be anything that's greater than or equal to 0, right? 0 is the default, meaning all of these are going to be the same. They're not going to grow. But we can set it to something like 1. And actually, yeah, we won't actually see an immediate change. And the reason is that when you're talking about flex grow, it has to be relative to its children, or relative to its constituent elements, right? So here, hold on one sec. Let me see if I can think of like a better example here, or if we can like, we could, yeah, here, let me make the container a little larger. So if we go ahead and make this a column, and we change the height to something like 200 viewport height units, which is percentage units of your viewport, right? then you can see now that we have this extra space in our container, this particular element, wheat, which we wanted to show off, is now way larger. So obviously we're not going to have anything meaningful happen here because we're looking at a column right now, so it's just going to affect the height. But you can imagine if we change something like the width per se, right? Then it would grow to take up a little bit more space. Maybe we get a little bit more of the image going. Could be pretty helpful, right? So the only time that this growth is going to come into play is when you have extra space in your container, right? So without specifying the height in our container, or a minimum height is actually a better example, we're not going to have any extra space left over. And as a result, we're just going to see the same old behavior that we always do. Great. So what are some other things that we might want to think about though? We've talked about growth. There's one on the other side of this theme that may be handy to know.
I mean, it would look nice if they were spread out more evenly.
Okay. I'm actually liking this. So we're going in a very free flow manner right now. Yeah, let's talk about how to space out things. It's still pretty natural if you ask me. Okay. What we're going to talk about now is something that's pertaining to the parent. Okay. So meaning the container, right? And we're going to talk about how we can distribute the remaining space in our container or the space around our elements, right? How we can basically control how the elements should get stacked up, all right? And we're going to be adjusting all of this with, get this, justify content, okay? Justify content takes a variety of values, mostly the ones we talked about earlier. It can take things like center, it can take things like stretch, it can take space around, space evenly. And all this is going to do is basically change how the free space remaining in your container is going to be laid out across all the elements. So let's pick something that will have an immediate effect, like space around. Let me see if I set this up properly. Yeah. So if we set space around, right, then it's going to take the space that's left over and it's going to just kind of put your elements out such that they're evenly distributed in your container, right? So in this case, we had a little bit of space left over in the end there, in our second row, right? And what ended up happening is it distributed that free space on both sides of our card, right? That makes sense? Sweet. Now, what are some other values we can use here? Well, we can use space between. What space between does is it puts all that free space in between your elements. Right, what it says on, yeah, it's exactly what it says on the tin. So in this case, our elements are going to end up on either end of their row, right? So if I said, here, like if I adjust our viewport a little bit, you can see as we get more width, the space is still distributed evenly between them, right? And just to kind of drill this in, let's contrast this to space around, where you can see the space is still distributed evenly around them. It's pretty nice. Some other things that we can do is center, meaning, as you say, well, as you can see right here, your flex items, meaning the children of the container, are going to be packed in towards the center of your line. So the center of the line being the main axis, right? So if we give ourselves enough room, you can see they're just going to be packed together with their default padding, default margin at the very center of our main axis, right? Now, if I changed this to, say, column, right? And then I set some height. Let's say I set a minimum height of 200 viewport height units again. Then what do you think is going to happen? And just for sake of conversation, we'll make it so it doesn't wrap around.
It would just be a column then, right?
Yeah. And what would end up happening, oh, whoops, we still have flex grow on this guy.
Oh, yeah.
Here, let's get rid of that. Okay, so you can see here, now that it's a column, right? It's still packing in all of your elements on the center of the main axis. Notice, since it's a column, the main axis is going top to bottom, right? So that's pretty helpful to know. This is especially handy, justify content, that is especially handy if you have, say, a collection of, it's actually kind of popular for nav bars as well. Although there is a nav element you can just.
In general, I'll just say that justify content center and what we will learn soon, align item center, are like the most common ways to vertically center something. And if you look up on Stack Overflow, one of the most upvoted questions of all time is how do I vertically center something in CSS? So this is the answer. You used to have to do some dumb table hack or align height stuff. But if you ever want to vertically center just one thing, like maybe you have your intro website and it's like, hi, my name is Peter Flanders. And you want to have that centered right in the middle of the web page, no matter how tall or short the viewport is. Justify content center is your friend. And you'll see it there all the time.
Yes. We will talk very shortly about that because that is one of the probably most like that's where Flexbox dominates, you know? It is probably one of the best use cases just because, yeah, back in the day, like Matt was saying, the table hack was what you had in ways of vertical, horizontal centering. Nowadays, you can just use a flex container. It's really nice. Okay, so the last two values we can use here for justify content are flex start, meaning the start of the container, like I mentioned earlier. And as you can see here, if I can stretch, yeah, there we go. It's just going to pack them all at the start. And we can also use flex end, which will do exactly what you expect it to. Pretty handy. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about the second most important part of the Flexbox layout, and that is align items. Okay, align items is used to align your elements based on the free space remaining on your cross axis. Okay, so if I'm talking about a row, right? The cross axis is going to be going top to bottom, assuming the row is left to right, right? Then what this property is going to do is determine how your elements line up on that cross axis, right? So let me go ahead and show you, or well, how the free space is going to be distributed. So let's go ahead and leave justify content at space around. I like space around, just looks nice, keeps things airy. We're going to go ahead and set align items to the first of many values. Let's do flex start for beginners. Okay. We didn't quite notice any difference, did we? Did you see anything change, Peter? I'll give you a hint. There's like one thing that changed.
Yeah, I was gonna say the size of the coin.
Yeah, so what this is going to do is it's going to be agnostic to the height of your elements. It's not going to set them to the same. We'll learn why in a second. And what it's going to do is cram them all up at the top, all right? That is at the start of your cross axis, right? So if we're looking at this, the cross axis in this case is going to be going top to bottom. So in this case, it crams them all at the top. Let's look at the antithesis of this, being the end. Does exactly what we expect. And similarly to justify content, we also have center. In this case, you can see it centers your items right on there. You can think of this as distributing the space remaining on the cross axis around the element on the top and bottom, or you can think of it as lining up the center of your item directly on the main axis. Just two different ways of thinking about it. And then let's see here. Before we talk about stretch, I'll talk about baseline. Baseline is going to align your items so that this is kind of a difficult concept to explain. Let's go ahead and take a look at the documentation here, right? So if we type in baseline right now, if the flex items inline axis is the same as the cross axis, it's the same as flex start. Otherwise, it participates in the baseline alignment, okay? So we'll learn a little bit more about what like these complicated things like inline axis mean. But for now, what you can think of it as is it's going to shove everything up to flex start by default, unless you specify otherwise in the child itself, okay? Then the last thing we're going to talk about is stretch, and this is the default. And it stretches your items, so they're all the same height. Pretty handy. Okay, so we've learned about how we can distribute free space on the main and cross axes. Let's talk about something else. what if I had multiple rows of content? Let's go ahead and make a few more, right? I'll just copy and paste this a bunch. So now we have like a ton of wheat. Kind of interesting, I guess. I really wanted to advertise my wheat. I'll go ahead and make this a wrap, just so that way we have multiple rows of it. Pretty handy. There are ways that we can actually organize each row of this now, right? So when we're thinking of organization of rows, like what's something that comes to mind, I guess? I think Peter's currently in the middle of something, so I'll go ahead and just take this one. So we can organize the free space between our rows, right? Between the rows or columns of our Flex container. So in this case, what we could do is use the same regions as always. We could use the start, the center, the end, space around, space between, we could stretch them. And the way that we manage all of this is with align content, right? Again, this is something that you apply on the parent. So let's take a look at align content with a value of flex start, the start of the container. And we're not going to actually get a phenomenal view of this now that I'm thinking about it, because flex start is going to just look kind of the same. Nothing changes for us, right? But you'll notice the big difference when we look at this in comparison to something like flex end, and we set a height as well. I'll set something really big just to get the point across. So now that we have flex end set and our container is ridiculously tall, right? Everything, all the rows are pushed to the very end, right? And if we change the viewport size, it keeps that same layout, it still wraps them nicely, but it also keeps it at the bottom of the container, which is something you might want to do. Here, let's go ahead and, I'm not trying to tile, there we go. Let's go ahead and look at the other ones. So here, I'll make a really tall container just for sake of conversation. Other values we can do, just like align items, we can do center. So if you see here, all the free space in our container is now distributed around it. You can think of this as cross-axis. Again, we're distributing space along it. We're trying to pack them in the center. Now, what are some other values we've used? We used two that had to do with dealing with space, right? In this case, space between. If we go ahead and use that, you can see it immediately reflected. We're going to have one row that's crammed at the very bottom, one row that's crammed at the very top, and in between, we'll have evenly spaced rows. Very nice. And of course, space around, which is also pretty handy because this way you have a natural viewport sensitive margin. Very handy, right? So when we're looking at this and our container is absolutely massive, right? We're still going to have a pretty nice looking margin if we change it to 200 viewport height units, right? Still very nice. And then of course, we also have stretch, which means exactly what you might think it means. It stretches all of your rows such that they will take up all the remaining space. Great. Okay, so that covers all of the actual properties that we can talk about for the container. Not too many, right? A surprising amount of customizability, surprising amount of flexibility, well, as you might expect from Flexbox, for, for controlling how your elements look, right? So I'll go ahead and leave our settings as they are right now. I'll change this to space around, actually. Looks a little nicer, I guess. And now we're going to move on to talking about the last part of Flexbox, which is basically the properties of the children, right? So I will go ahead and make a new element of our Flex container, the star of the show. In this case, I'm going to make this one barley, right? So since when I copied and pasted to make a bunch of products, right, they all got the ID highlight. So we're going to go ahead and change it up a bit. We're going to use barley now. Okay, we talked earlier about FlexGrow, right? So if I have a really tall container, things are going to get a little funky because one of these guys is going to be able to grow to take up the remaining space in its row, right? Well, here, since we're using rows, you won't see it. But if it were like column, right, then you would be able to see it. I'm going to go ahead and go back to where we were. Okay, we talked about grow, but we can also talk about something else. Shrink. This is what I was trying to get at a little earlier in the lesson. These properties for the children, they tend to come in partners, right? So flex grow and flex shrink. In this case, what we can use these for is relative sizing, right? Think of it as fractional. So if I have these two elements, right, corn and barley, in fact, let's ID them as such so we can really get this going. Here's corn, there's barley. Then we can describe their behavior in sizing relative to one another on the current row, right? So let's go ahead and make it so I really want to show off my corn. I'll say flex grow is 1, but nothing's going to happen, right? Because there's no free space. Right now, our settings don't really allow that. But where things will get interesting is if we allow barley to shrink. Oh, wait, hold on. I need to actually specify this so it's a little bit more explicit. But what happens is your spacing, right, is going to it's going to basically make one of them larger in dimension than the other because of the fact that its neighbor can shrink and it can grow, right? So let's go ahead and kind of clean up this container a little bit. Maybe I'll make it way wider, actually. I feel like that might be nice. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get rid of those. And I'll make it like 200 viewport width units. Wait, hold on. Let's go ahead and make it a column too. I'm just trying to play around so that way I can get this to a good example. Oy vey. Okay, I'm going to try not to spend too much time on this because we have 10 minutes left. So I'll just zoom through the rest. But you can use flex grow and flex shrink. There are great examples of this actually right here on this resource, which is wonderful for Flexbox. It's a bunch of big, colorful GIFs or GIFs, depending on how you want to say it, that show you how it all works together. Very cool.
One just a quick thing I'll say about flex grow and shrink is
Sure.
The most common default application is to create sticky footers. So we talked about position sticky and how that works for headers, right? So when you scroll and then eventually it'll join the top. A sticky footer is when you want to have a footer always be at the bottom of the page. But if your page is too small, it'll just push the footer like up and you'll have some awkward space in between the end of the footer and the bottom of the page. So use flex grow and shrink there. And that's like probably like 50% of people's Google searches for flex grow and flex shrink. And it's a problem that like the ACM website had. So I submitted a PR to fix that, TeachLA's website, all that kind of stuff. So this part's super relevant. If you're watching at home, you'll use this all the time. So thank you for explaining it well, Leah.
Of course. Thank you, Matt. Okay. Just to kind of wrap up the things that we can talk about here really quick. One more property you can do on the children of a Flexbox container is align self. Now we remember align items, right? It's kind of like dictating how all of your elements are going to get placed within their respective rows or within their respective columns, right? So in this case, here, let me clean this up a bit just so it's easier. Well, I did this so that way we could actually demonstrate the difference, right? So what I've done here is I've set up a container where the align items value is flex start, right? So what that's going to mean is at the start of the cross axis, all your elements are going to get crammed, right? So in this case, all of them are put at the top of their rows. But what if, okay, we had a particular card that we wanted to pull out of the flow, or maybe we wanted to create a nice staggered effect between our cards. We wanted one to be up, then one to be down, one up, one down, right? Based on the free space left in that row. Well, we can do that with align items. Align self, sorry. Align self is like align items, but just for one particular element, right? So in this case, what I did is I set it to flex end for corn. And you can see now it's pulled out of the flow. It's going to get put to the bottom, right? Pretty handy. And if we wanted to do something really fancy, which we'll learn a little bit more about later, we could use a CSS selector, which I won't do right now, to stagger our elements, right? So we could have one down, one up, one down, one up, based on the free space. Pretty cool. Okay, and then in the last few minutes here, I'm going to skip over, actually, no, I won't skip over anything. I can talk about this last part. For the last thing for the child is flex basis, okay? Now, what flex basis is it's like the default length or size based on the main axis, right? So if I wanted each of these to be, or I wanted corn to be 500 pixels on the main axis, right? So in this case, wide, right? On our page, we would do so by specifying it on flex basis. We would also need the ability for all the other things to shrink a little bit. Or well, here, I want to get to grid in the last 6 minutes, but that's something to bear in mind. You can set it so that it has a default width or height based on the main axis, right? So let's go ahead and clean that up, and I'm going to go ahead and demo the very last few minutes here, the CSS grid. Okay, now we've talked about Flexbox, which is pretty handy for creating rows, columns, and very clean syntax, right? It's not very difficult to look at on your document. Screen readers can go through it really easy. It's flexible to your viewports. Lots of pluses here, okay? But if we wanted to do something a little more rigid, we want to create like a grid of content, right? Maybe something like 2 by 2 for our purposes, right? So I'll go ahead and do 4 elements in here. If we go and take a look, since it's grid container and nothing's been declared in its CSS, we're not going to see anything reflected until we specify display grid. Now, if we take a look, nothing happens because we still need to specify how the grid is going to behave, okay? And the way we do this is really easily, okay? I'm going to just show you really quick how you can create a grid, and then I'll probably wrap it up. We can specify the dimensions of the grid, the rows, the columns, with grid, grid template rows and grid template columns. So what we do in this particular CSS property is we specify the value that we want, or the width, right, or the height of each particular row or column. So if I wanted to have 2 rows, each of them being 50 pixels, I would do that, right? If I wanted to have 2 columns, each being 50 pixels, I would do that. But that's not going to look very good, right? We didn't give them nearly enough space, obviously. So what we can do instead is something that's a little bit cleaner, okay? We can do something like percentages. Distribute the space that our container would occupy more evenly. So if we give each 50%, then we're going to have a nice, neat 2 by 2 grid. But wait, I'm going to show you something even easier, okay? What if we had 33%? We want to make a 3 by 3 grid, right? That's pretty gross to look at in the CSS, isn't it? Right? And it's not exact because we're just saying 33%. We're not getting precise here. What we can do is use a magic keyword, auto. What does auto do? Well, it just automatically distributes the space. So you just type auto for as many rows and columns as you'd like. It'll automatically do so. And look at that. That is exact. And if I wanted to put this back at a 2 by 2, easy as that, right? Pretty handy. And if I wanted to automatically have 1 row that takes up the remaining space after I make one of them, say 100 pixels, then we can do that too. And you can see it got chopped up because it doesn't really know what to do here. Grid is not quite as flexible as Flexbox. So something to bear in mind here. but it is handy. It does have its applications here. Some other properties you can do with grid, just to wrap this up here. You can also specify the space between them. So in this case, you would do grid, oh gosh, what's the property again? It's grid column gap. Oh, it's obsolete, sorry. Excuse me, I shouldn't teach you this. There used to be a property where you could specify the gap between elements in the grid. Now you would probably just use padding, but it's something to bear in mind that you can do with the grid. Gosh, there's also a variety of properties actually that are very similar to Flexbox that you can do in grid, like align content, justify content. But for our purposes, I'm going to just focus on giving you guys the bare minimum of understanding how grid works. If you'd like to learn more, a great resource for CSS Grid I recommend is CSS Tricks Guide to CSS Grid. They have literally every property and how it works and how it looks visually for you to look at. So sorry, that was kind of a lot of me talking, but hopefully you all learned something. Do I do my YouTube or outro? Okay, I gotta do my YouTube or outro. Yeah, so if you, as always, this is going to be a recorded lecture. If you have any questions at all, feel free to DM Matt or I on Slack if you're on there. If not, you can leave a comment and we'll get to it. What else? If you'd like to learn more, I have in the README, which will be posted in the description for this lesson, a variety of resources. And I mean like a variety, right? So I don't actually have all of them listed here because I am yet to push them. But there's a lot of resources out there for you to learn CSS, Flexbox, Grid, both very valuable tools. So that just about does it. I'll see y'all in the next one.